These are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the Practice Discipleship Initiative webinar series. My name is Dawn Troutman. I'm your host for this series. You may know me from throughout the Lutheran world and also from the planning team that plans the extravaganza that happens each January, February. And I'll tell you more about that at the end if you're not familiar with it. This initiative is a dynamic partnership between the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, the ELCA and its youth gathering, and ELCA seminaries and colleges. Practice Discipleship offers leadership development for the sake of faith formation. The theme for this year is Wonder. There are a series of 7 webinars that focus on Lutheran theology, ministry theory, and practical skills relating to our theme. Today's webinar is entitled Wondering About the Church. Our presenter today is Peggy Hahn, who is the Executive Director of LEAD and Assistant to the Bishop in the Texas Gulf Coast Synod. You'll be able to ask questions and make comments as we go, so please take a moment to find the box. It should be on the right side of your screen. That's where you can type in questions. When I see those questions come in, I'll repeat them so that Peggy can answer you. And we will get to as many questions as possible, so please do take advantage of that box if you are listening live. So welcome, Peggy.
Well, hello, Dawn. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for being here.
It's exciting to be here with you, and I really appreciate the chance to get to talk to you about my favorite topic, and that is the church.
Oh, good.
So the topic of our conversation is wondering about the church, and I think it's a personal question, really, for each of us, because this is our watch. Each one of us are invited to think about our own leadership in the church. And if you're like me, I bet you're wondering about the same question I am, and that's the one on the slide. What can we do, what can I do personally, that will really make a difference at this time in the history of our church?
Mm-hmm. Big question.
Yeah. Honestly, as we watch our church, we can see many of our congregations getting smaller, frankly, the population getting older, and without too much effort, it seems like our congregations quickly move into survival mode. And so this question is really important because this is our watch and this is our opportunity to take seriously our invitation to be a leader. And I think especially for those of us in this conversation who care so much about our ministry with children, with families, and with youth, as we think about what's going on in the Christian movement right now, we're really struggling to find our path forward. What we've learned with LEAD through our research has been that we can't focus on everything, but there are some particular places that we can pay attention that will make a big difference in what we're doing. And so those are the things I'd like to talk with you about today.
I love it. Let's go. This is good.
Okay, well, because I'm jumping in, so hopefully that's good.
Yes.
And maybe as we do jump in, I want to mention that what I'm sharing with you comes from all the listening that we have done. So as LEAD started as an organization 3 years ago, we began by listening to leaders one-on-one. I personally listened to 60 pastors in 3 weeks. And since then have continued to listen. We're over 400 people that we've listened to one-on-one, and then probably another 400 or 500 people that we've listened to by way of feedback that they have given us through being at conferences and speaking and that kind of thing. So what I'm bringing you in this conversation today is our best thinking and hopefully helpful for you. So let's focus for a minute on this question because this is a real question. What can you really do as a leader right now in the church? I want to ask you, everyone who's listening, to just take a second and do your own personal reflection about what you can really do.
I love that. And whatever comes to mind, please type it into the box. I want to hear, and I think that'll give us a baseline for our conversation. So let us know what you can really do. What have you heard already? What are a couple answers you've already run across, Peggy?
Well, I'm not going to jump to that. I'm going to move past that question and go to the next slide.
Ooh,
Because what
okay.
I'd like to do, Chris, if you don't mind, thank you, is to now move to what I think is the harder question. This is the one that I want to jump into to have us think about. And that is, what is keeping us from stepping more deeply into the waters of our baptism, ready to join God in mission? So what are the barriers that are keeping us from doing that thing that we've already identified that we might do?
Mm-hmm.
So this is, again, another real question. What is stopping you from growing as a leader? Now, I've been asking this question all over the country, and so I'm really curious about the kinds of answers that will come from you on this one. So not only, as I asked at first, what can you do, but what's in the way? What's stopping you from using the gifts that you have to take seriously this opportunity to be a Christian leader right now in this time and place? I'm hoping some of you will share your thoughts on this.
Yes.
So, go ahead.
I feel like sometimes I hear that people don't feel empowered to step forth. That seems to be a theme. Nick wrote, it's communication. That's what he can do. It's not what's in his way. Christine wrote that she can be a positive catalyst. Allison wrote that she can create. So those are things they can do as a leader. And we're just getting some answers to what's in the way. What have you heard from people about what's in the way?
It's interesting. The number one thing that I have heard about what's keeping people stuck and that is stopping them from growing, the things that are the roadblocks as they're wondering about leading the church, the number one answer I have received over and over and over is a lack of confidence.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Lisa wrote fear of failure, which seems related to what you said. Mara wrote the world's other priorities are in the way. Allison said time's in the way. And Andrew said stay open and attentive to the voice and movement of the Holy Spirit. Thank you all for jumping in. Mark wrote what's in the way? Insecurities that I have the gifts and skills needed. Keep the answers coming, but I'm going to throw it back to you, Peggy.
Nice. Well, it sounds like those answers are reinforcing what I've already heard, and I appreciate your honesty in answering this question, because it's easy for us to sort of ignore the truth, and that is, for most of us, the way in which we've been trained to be leaders in the church, or even if we haven't been trained at all, but the fact that we wind up as leaders in the church right now, the things that we're doing isn't as helpful as it used to be. We're getting to lead in a church at a time of huge change. And so it's really helpful for us to stop for a minute to ask what's in the way. And here's why. The truth is that we know that leadership is hope. And now let that sink in on you. I mean, the fact is we're wondering about our church. The most hopeful thing that we have going on outside of the fact that, frankly, we are people of faith, is the fact that we believe that God still works in leaders like you and I to make a difference in the world. That the Spirit is still working. That same God who was there in the early church is the God who is with us today and still working among us. And you'll hear that as a theme from me as we talk about this. Leadership is hope.
I want to share, there's so many good answers. I'm going to share a few more with you.
Let's hear it.
I mean, they're all great. Even if I don't say yours, please know they're all great. Lisa wrote to do our best to be loving to all, and it just jumped, I'm so sorry. Loving the church, Christ's body, as Jesus loved us, being an example to others, encouraging them to grow and step out of their comfort zones and learning evangelism. David wrote what's in the way. We are told Heidi wrote that she herself is in the way. So honest, Heidi. I hear you.
Yes, me too.
Bryant wrote the naysayers, the people that don't want to experiment. And so many things about that overlap with what you've already said, but I just wanted to pull out some of those answers from our listeners. Thank you all for typing in.
Well, I really appreciate hearing what you're thinking, because it helps us all, I think, maybe feel a little bit better about our own places in this work that we're doing as leaders. And I guess what I want you to know as you think about your own role is to realize that our world is changing so quickly that the very operating systems that we are used to working from have shifted so that the things that used to work in the past are no longer working, and that's not because we aren't doing our job. It's not our fault. It's just the truth that we are serving in a very different time and place. I want to introduce to you a little bit of thinking that comes from a writer named Mark Dunkelman. He's written a book called The Vanishing Neighbor. Mark has really been helpful for me to understand in terms of some of the things that have changed in our world relationally and how they are impacting us. So Chris, if you could switch the slide, that would be awesome. Let's go one more.
And quick answer to that last slide that we just went past.
More.
Yeah, one more. I know I'm jumping in, but everyone is so wise. Deb wrote that she is not confident she has the influence to make a difference, and she doesn't have the skills. She's unable to keep up with technological changes. That has some overlap with you saying it's a changing world. It's changing in many ways, not just culturally.
I think all of those things are helping to erode our confidence, in all honesty. It's hard to keep up with the changes in technology. I mean, I struggle with that all the time. What Mark Dunkelman has written, and see if this doesn't help you as you think about this, that in the history of the United States, just focusing on our country, in the history of the United States, there's been an operating system in place that has helped relationships happen. You might, in fact, think about each of us, and on the slide you'll see this picture of Saturn, and which is an image he uses, and you think about yourself as the center, as the planet itself, and what's orbiting around you are, in fact, circles of relationships that you're part of. And the circle of relationship that's most closer to you, Mark calls the inner ring. Mm-hmm. The next level he calls the middle ring, and then finally the outer ring. That inner ring, middle ring and outer ring have been in place since the United States was an agricultural economy, and when people moved into the cities, that way of operating with those three rings of relationships moved with us from the countryside into the cities and even into an urban context for those who have done that. And this is over hundreds of years. That very operating system has remained intact so that people have an inner ring, which is their family and friends, a middle ring, which is your community. You might identify that by knowing the people you sit on the bleachers with at a Little League game or running into people you know at the grocery store. That kind of is your middle ring. And then the outer ring would be where most people have had the weakest amount of relationships, and that would be in community or in an external community where you probably don't know very many people. Well, what's changing now, and he makes, I think, a really compelling argument, that what has changed is that this operating system, which has held us, thick inner ring, thick middle ring, thinner outer ring, has completely shifted with technology and social ministry. And I know your head's already thinking this. So what's happening now, and this is like a whole different operating platform for relationships. And let's face it, if we're talking about the church, we're talking about relationships, right? So what he's saying is that our inner ring has actually gotten more intense and more whole, so that we have often a thicker, more focused energy on our families, and our dearest friends. Our middle ring, however, has reduced, and the outer ring has gotten thicker. Think about what's happening on the outer ring as we think about what's happening on Facebook, right?
Yes.
So there is this wider population of people now in our lives. And as Mark points out, our brains are wired to manage relationships and actually can only manage about 150 relationships at any given point, which is kind of why there are some of those people in your lives that you wish you had stayed in touch with over the years, but you just can't seem to get around to making that happen. And
they're number 151.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, and I wish so much I could be in touch with those folks. Well, the truth is you just can't. Like, physically, your brain cannot manage that much knowledge about more than 150 people. Mm-hmm. So I'm getting to my point. Here's why this is important to us as leaders in the church. Because guess where the church sits? In these relationships, the church sits in the middle ring, okay? Mm-hmm. And so what's happening is where the middle ring is reducing and reducing and reducing, so is the bandwidth that is keeping institutions going. And in this shift in the culture in which we're listening, in which is going on around us,
yes,
and the fact that we're now more focused on the inner ring and the outer ring, it's making it harder and harder for people to have a bandwidth to participate in this middle ring of the church and where institutions sit. I hope this is making sense to you guys.
It totally is, and it's very dramatic. If you're looking for this book,
Yeah.
the link is already on our Twitter, our Practice Discipleship Twitter, and it will soon be on the Facebook page, or obviously you can just go to Amazon and put The Vanishing Neighbor in. So it is actually on the Facebook page just now. But you can, we have a great team behind the scenes. It's not me. I cannot take credit. I'm listening to you. That's my only job, Peggy. But it does make sense, because I think all of us have experienced what is happening to institutions. Why are they not getting the bandwidth that they once were? So it's making a lot of sense. We've all experienced it, and you've put some framework around it. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I think my question is, what can I do if I'm a leader and I'm wondering about the church, and this is the lay of the land? A brand new operating platform where actually what's happening in my family, my inner ring and my dearest friends, and what's happening on the outer ring I'm paying attention to on social media. What does that mean for my leadership in the church? And how can we either reclaim that middle ring, and at some level we want to do that, and how can we make sure that we can find ways of being the church in that inner ring and at the outer ring? So it's shifting the way we're thinking about where church operates.
Mm-hmm.
So here, let me share some things that we're working on that we're seeing that's making a difference, and really want to invite you to think about this. What we're learning that makes a huge difference, if you'll switch to the next slide, is that we can't do everything, but we can do something. We can listen. Now, with LEAD, we've recognized that really there are 4 behaviors that are most helpful at taking on these changes in our world, but the most important is this first one, and it's the behavior of listening. Important things happen when we listen, when we deeply listen. We offer other people respect and dignity. We are changed by what we hear from other people. So this kind of listening doesn't kind of roll in one ear and out the other, right? Mm-hmm. And it changes the way we actually even understand God. So what I want to spend the rest of our time on in this conversation is to focus on, as we're wondering about the church, let's wonder what it is to be people of faith who are paying attention by deeply listening. In fact, I'm going to invite us into trying a little personal exercise in just a minute.
I love it.
Yeah, it'll be tricky to do in this format, but I'm certain we can make it happen. Now, when I'm talking about listening, I'm not just talking about casual listening at a light level. In fact, Judith Glaser has written an amazing book called Conversational Intelligences, which I highly recommend, where she points out that there are 3 different levels of conversation that we have, and the goal is for us to move to a level 3 conversation. As we are learning to move into these deeper kinds of conversations, what it really boils down to is paying attention to how we listen. I kind of, in the work that I've done in the church, call it a 3-date process, because listening actually is something that takes a little courage in the way in which I'm talking about it. Now, LEAD has a resource called the Tune-In Process, where we're teaching people how to listen to God in Scripture and prayer, listen to God in the congregation, and listen to God out in the community. It's that deeper listening that we're actually helping people learn how to practice. So I want to talk about this kind of deep listening, because it is a listening that can shape our whole way of being. Maybe look at the next slide, and let's take a look at the different blind spots that Judith offers for us. I had forgotten about this great slide. So the idea of listening is to care enough to cross boundaries and to be fully present. Understanding that actually as we practice listening, we might actually be hearing God speaking through the person who's listening to us. So there we go. So I want to talk with you a minute about the blind spots that we have when we listen if we aren't really paying attention. And these are super helpful from Judith Glaser. First is the assumption that when we see, feel, and think and hear, what we see, the assumption that others see, think, feel, and hear what we see, think, feel, and hear. Let that soak in for a second. So the assumption that my worldview is your worldview. Are you hearing it?
Yes, I feel like everyone does that.
Yeah.
And we hear it a lot. Yeah, we hear it a
Exactly.
lot. Yes.
But it's a huge blind spot, and as we're listening to others, we have to get rid of that kind of a listening filter as we're deeply listening, recognizing that I need to hear through your ears, not through my own, if that makes any sense. Because, frankly, this assumption will stop us from really hearing what is being said. The second is a failure to realize that fear, trust, and distrust change how we see, feel, and hear and interpret reality, and therefore how we talk about reality. In other words, if we're afraid and we have a low trust or even a distrust with the person that we're listening to, we're going to interpret the things that they have to say to us in a particular way, often in a negative way. And yet, if we can bring a more trusting posture to our listening, our entire way of listening will shift. So what I'm doing is I'm introducing to you these blind spots by way of helping you frame your own listening ear and helping you think about how you can increase your capacity to be a better listener, if indeed we think listening is a serious way for us to engage in this time of change in our world, and I do. Number 3, she says, the inability to stand in each other's shoes when we are fearful of or upset. So it is impossible when we go into listening to someone if we're upset to actually be objective. And you know that, I'm sure, from your own experience. Number 4, assumptions that we remember what others say. I love this one. When we actually remember what we think about what others say.
Oh, that's very powerful.
I mean, it really is. It really is. So as I was doing the listening for LEAD as we were getting started, for example, I did 90% of the listening with a second person in the room, both of us taking notes. And after doing the day's worth of listening, we would compare notes. It was very interesting how me and my listening partner would get something different out of the conversation. You know, and if you've ever been on a trip where you've written a journal and you've compared your journal to others and you realize that you were in the same room but you got different experiences, I think this is where this comes from.
Oh, yes.
And then finally, the assumption that meaning resides in the speaker when in fact it really resides in the listener. So it is the person who's listening that makes meaning out of what is being heard. I raise these up for you as you think about growing your own capacity to be a listener, because I think if there is one leadership skill that is going to make all the difference as we're wondering about leading the church today and in the future, it's how we expand our capacity to listen.
And I see a lot in there. You said leadership is hope at the beginning of this webinar, and yes. These are all about breaking down fears as far as I can see. So very powerful. And if you are listening and want that resource, Conversational Intelligence, there's a link both on Twitter and Facebook. If you're listening after the fact, you can see that these resources are listed right under the video, right on the same page. So thank you. These are all about breaking down fear. I love that.
So let's try a little activity just to have you recognize your own unique place in the world. And we're going to have to use our imagination as we do this today, since we're having this virtual conversation. But let's imagine if you were in a room with me, I would ask you to walk from one side of the room to the other, depending on where you would take a stand on the question I'm about to ask you. But because we are not in the same room together, I'm going to invite you to just make a mental note of where you might fall on the spectrum. Because what I'm inviting you to do is to become aware a little bit of your own personal biases that come from your own life experience. Because the fact of the matter is each of us listen through our own ears. And as you can see, even by those assumptions from Judith Glaser or from what you know from other active listening exercises you've done, we have to be very conscious of other people falling in a different place in order for us to be able to open ourselves up to be a more present listener. So, okay, I'm going to ask you a few questions. You're going to have to just mentally decide where you would head in a room. And imagine others you know. So you'll have to get in your head a virtual group of people and imagine where they might take a stand on the same question. Okay, are you with me?
Totally with you. So, like, way to the left of us is going to be whatever room we're in. Way to the left is going to be one end of a dichotomy, and way to the right is another end of a dichotomy?
That's exactly right.
Awesome.
So, if your parents worked at night and on weekends to support your family, you will go to one side of the room. Okay, let's say you would go to the left side of the room.
Great.
Now, the next one would be if you're able to move through the world without fear of assault, move to the other side of the room. Let me read that again. If you're able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault, move to the other side of the room. Are you moving in your head? The next one, if you can show affection for your romantic partner in a public place without fear of ridicule or violence, move to the other side of the room, the left side of the room. If you've ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, move to the right side of the room. If the primary language spoken in your household growing up was not English, move to the left side of the room. If you came from a supportive family environment, move to the right side of the room. If you've ever tried to change your speech or mannerisms to gain credibility, move to the other side of the room. And just do a couple more, so hang in there with me. If you can make mistakes and not have people attribute your behavior flaws to your racial or gender group, move across the room. If you or your parents have ever gone through a divorce, move to the other side of the room. If you felt like you had adequate access to healthy food growing up, move across the room. If you get time off your religious holidays, move across the room. Now, those of you who work for the church are smiling because you probably have to work, don't you? If you have ever felt like there was not adequate or accurate representation of your racial group, sexual orientation group, gender group, disability group in the media, move across the room. And one more. If you can buy new clothes or go out to dinner when you want to, move across the room. I'm going to stop there. But I have a list in front of me of 35 of these different kinds of questions that cause you to think a little bit about where you personally stand in the social, economic, ethnic, and gender realities of our world. And I'm raising these up because as we think about becoming people who listen and who are expanding our capacity to be listeners, we want to take seriously the fact that our own reality is not the reality of everyone around us necessarily, and certainly not the people that we'll listen to. And that an awareness of how each of these dynamics that you just pondered impacts the way you think and the way you respond to any given situation and the way you hear what's being said. Does that make sense?
Yes, I've heard some of those examples used with different versions of privilege. We all have our own versions of privilege in different ways depending on who we are and how we grew up, but a lot of those are similar dichotomies.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I guess as I'm not able to totally move you around the room in this kind of a virtual format, it would be great for those who are listening to write in what they're thinking now as they imagine expanding their capacity to listen more deeply, as they imagine what it is to wonder about the church in a way that becomes people of faith who are listeners. I would be really curious what you're thinking as you hear Judith Glazer's list of blind spots, as you hear these different really positions of privilege or power, as you call it, Dawn. I think it is like a position of privilege. I think of it as a position of power or powerlessness. You know, if people have any kind of reflections they'd like to write in about that, that could be interesting to hear.
Thank you. So we'd love to hear, just to back you up in the box, even if you haven't jumped in yet, jump in now, of how this activity, both that list and then this activity of mentally moving around the room, affected your ideas about how to be a listener and the ways in which you may or may not be able to grow in your listening. Thank you.
So as I've done this exercise with people, and I encourage the use of exercises like this if you're trying to help those that you work with sharpen their capacity to listen, it's been very sobering. It's been an exercise where people have found themselves maybe very uncomfortable because they find that they have more privilege than they realized, or maybe more privilege than they realized with the people in the room around them, or they've been in the other position where they realize that they have is not only are we learning to listen better, but we're confronting our own way of thinking about ourselves, and it gets at a little bit of the question of confidence. Of who am I as a leader, and what is God doing in me, and how can my gifts be helpful in this time in our church, right?
Yes. Here's some reflections. Andrew, I have some really great ones. Andrew wrote, "Be still and know that I am God. It requires us to stop, be quiet, and listen." Ed wrote, "As a white male that is 6'4" and part of the upper middle class, I recognize I don't always hear or understand people's fears."
Yes.
Ginny wrote, "Those questions were a real eye-opener about how much privilege we take for granted without even being aware of it." Thank you all. Julia wrote, "It's hard, holy work to gain the trust of different individuals to trust that we are truly listening." And David wrote, "I keep coming back to our beautiful churches are barriers to those in poverty." So keep them coming, but I'll let you make some comments on those, Peggy.
Okay, so those are really thoughtful responses. Thank you for your thoughts. I really, really appreciate your honesty in what you're saying, because it does make us sometimes confront ourselves. And here's the thing. The invitation here, and I hope you're hearing this as we're having this conversation, is to begin some really intentional listening, and listening beyond maybe people you might normally listen to. You know, all of us have the go-to group if we have a question to ask that we would normally turn to for information. More and more, we're having these kinds of conversations on Facebook, which I think it can be really rich because it broadens the base of people we might normally get to interact with. But what the real invitation I want to give to you now is to imagine if you were to be having some of these conversations and spending time seriously listening to people in the neighborhood around your congregation.
Ooh, it's like you're setting up this comment. I have 3 of them, but Deb wrote, "One thing I've deliberately done in the past year is join a chorus that's mostly people not of my demographic or race, partly because I love the music, but partly because after Ferguson," and she says she does live in that community, "I realize I need to expand my community and be able to form relationships with and listen to others who don't have all the privilege that I do." So I'll hold off on the other comments and let you continue. I just wanted to jump in when Deb was on your same wavelength.
Oh my gosh. And Deb, what you're talking about, to deliberately enter into a different community, is actually not just a way of listening, but it's an act of peacemaking. That is reconciliation work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about where is the church located in this changing time, that's one place we can be, is in the place of reconciliation and peacemaking. That's beautiful that you're doing that.
Oh, yes. So Ginny wrote, oh, I'm sorry, I just interrupted.
No, go ahead.
Ginny wrote, it's a wake-up call to open ourselves to those who operate on different planes. And Nick wrote that exercise he's used it through working residence life, camp environments, and now in the congregation where he serves. It's always sparked unique and powerful conversations that's sobering, eye-opening, and it's a great visual exercise showing how even though people can look the same, they can feel polar opposites. Thank you, Nick. It's not always apparent just by looking.
I think that's very, very key. So a lot of times, even in our own congregations, we think we're a pretty homogenized group. But you don't have to go very far below the surface to discover the stories that make people very unique from one another.
Mm-hmm.
And even to make space and time to do that, to listen to the people who are in your congregations, to be able to move those relationships to a place that has a deeper, more meaningful kind of relationship is so significant in what it means to be in the church today. And for those of us who work with young people, this is what gives you credibility, right? I mean, what they're looking for is authentic relationships. They have enough superficial relationships to last them the rest of their life.
Right.
And what they're looking for, right, is the real deal. And this is one thing we can offer, is a place where we can have these kind of relationships with high integrity. So I think even if you were to adopt this posture of listening to one another in a congregation, you would see a shift in what's happening in the relationships in your youth group or among families. I think it's one reason small group ministry has been able to be so significant in people's lives, is because of the consistency of meeting with the same group of people week after week. We lose our facade and we get more space and more time with each other to be able to have these deeper conversations.
It's more real.
It's more real. That's exactly right.
Julia wrote, as a leader, I feel it's my responsibility to create safe places for people to tell their story and know they are loved. Julia's all about the hope, as are many people who are writing in. Thank you.
That's awesome. It is hopeful. And, you know, when we do make that space to help people share that story, their own stories, we're doing something they don't normally get to do in their lives, right? So I call that their sacred story. When people get to share what God is up to in their lives or in their own story, whether it's an intentional invitation to listen to people one at a time, or whether it just happens in the course of conversation, that is sacred work as the church, to be in those deeper listening moments. And think about it. Don't you want that in your life? I mean, we all want that, to be known and to know others at a deeper level. Again,
so powerful.
It's sort of taking, if we go back to the 3 rings of relationships, it's taking that inner ring, our family and closest friends, and moving it out to the middle ring somewhat, right? Then we're making that middle ring have more meaning. So I want to kind of shift our thinking a little bit to from this experience. Unless, Dawn, are there any other really?
No, go ahead and shift.
Okay. Then I want to shift our thinking to recognize the fact that this idea of intentional listening, it shows up all through Scripture. I mean, this isn't like a brand new idea. This has been going on, right?
Oddly enough, the Bible has had the answer.
Well, I know. I don't usually like to think of it quite like that, but I know that you're right. I mean, there is a sense of these aha moments that God has been doing all through Scripture. We see it where people have had a chance to grow deeper in their listening, and where it has changed what's been going on. It happens when ordinary people are generally having this encounter with God's voice, right? Sometimes in the midst of even very mundane situations, God shows up moving in their lives. I want to take a minute to take a look at Acts 10, with you guys, and I am going to actually read a little bit out of Acts 10, but let me set the stage for you a little bit before we start to do that, okay, as we're moving, because I really want you to see where this listening, this deeper listening, turns out to be life-changing, not just for us, but actually for Peter, and what probably is a somewhat familiar text to you. But by way of just kind of expanding your thinking a little bit, I want to encourage you to think now about hanging out with Peter in the first century church. So that means letting go of this worldview and trying to locate ourselves back into Peter's world. And when I think about Peter's world, I have to remember that there was no such thing as Christian, right? There was no being a Christian. There was no Christian understanding. The fact is, all the people who were followers of Jesus were Jewish. And they were living out their passion and their belief of what Jesus was saying to them, which was very radical and even somewhat threatening, inside what would be their outer ring. Their outer ring would be the Roman Empire. Their middle ring would be Judaism, and the fact that these are people who went to synagogue, who practiced the holy days. But their core center ring, that inner ring, would be where they were the people who were followers of Jesus, if you can kind of use that to think about this text. And in fact, to be a Jewish person was to be very different than the average person living around them in the Roman Empire. So different that, in fact, when I had the opportunity to travel to Turkey and Greece and to visit the places where the Apostle Paul actually started some of our early churches, and notice that in many of these places, in the Colosseums, there were chairs that were set aside for the Jewish people. Like, they didn't even sit in the same place as everyone else. Wow. They were so unique because they were people who understood one God, monotheistic people. That was very, very countercultural to the rest of the environment. And I think it's hard for us to wrap our head around how unique that was probably in their day. But I think as we listen to this text, it's helpful to recognize the weirdness of what it meant first to be Jewish and then to be a Jesus follower. Okay, you're with me on this?
Yes, totally with you.
Okay, awesome. So let's look at Acts 10 for a minute. I'm going to read through this quickly. If you've got a Bible, you could follow along. In Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort. So that tells you this guy was a guy of power, and he had a group of people that were under him that he was in charge of, right? He was a centurion. He was a devout man who feared God with his whole household. So that told you that there were women and children around because he had a household. He gave alms generously to people, and he prayed constantly to God. One afternoon, about 3 p.m, he had a vision, which he clearly saw an angel of God coming in and saying to him, "Cornelius." And he stared at him in terror, and he said, "What is it, Lord?" "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon who was called Peter. He is lodging with Simon a tanner, whose house is by the seaside." When the angel spoke to him and left, he called two of his slaves, a devout soldier from the ranks of those who served him, and after telling them everything, he sent them to Joppa. Okay, that's step one in this text. You've got this Cornelius is sending the slaves, the servants. Okay, then about noon the next day, as they were on their journey, we've got Peter now on the scene. He goes up to the roof to pray. Not unusual because the roof was considered an extension of the home. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. While it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heavens opened up and something like a large sheet coming down, lowered to the ground by its 4 corners. In it were all kinds of 4-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again, a second time, "What God has made clean you must not call profane." This happened 3 times. The thing was suddenly taken up into heaven. Now, you guys already know probably the backstory. When something happens 3 times, that's a signal in Scripture that it's
Yes.
this is God, right? Pay attention.
Right.
Peter knew that too. So while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision he had seen, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. They called out to ask where Simon, who was called Peter, was staying. Peter was still thinking about the vision. The Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now, go down and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and he said, "I am the one you're looking for. For what is the reason of your coming?" And they answered him, "Cornelius, an upright and God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation," but by the way, wasn't Jewish, "was directly a holy angel sent for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say." So Peter invited him in and gave them lodging, which, by the way, he would have never normally done because he now invited in people who were not Jewish into his home. This is a no-no for most Jewish people at the time, but he did it because of the vision. The next day he got up, he went with them, and some of the believers from Joppa accompanied him. The following day they came to Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them, and he called his relatives and close friends. Upon arrival, Cornelius met him and, falling at his feet, worshipped him. But Peter made him get up, saying, "Stand up, I am only mortal." And as he talked with him, he went in and he found that many had assembled, and he said to them, "You yourself," this is Peter saying, "you yourself know it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection." And this goes on, but I'm going to skip to the punchline in verse 34. After Cornelius is asking to have his household baptized, Peter begins to speak, and he says, "Truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. You know the message he sent to the people of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all." Now, I take a moment in the middle of this webinar to read you this out of the book of Acts, not because I want you to fall asleep while I'm talking, so stay with me, but because I think it's important as we think about why listening matters. In the course of this story, and I could have picked many others, but in the course of this story, we have this extreme listening happening by Peter that not only does it transform Peter's life, but it transforms Cornelius's life and eventually makes way for the Apostle Paul to be able to carry on ministry, transforming the rest of the country, welcoming the Gentiles into the faith, into following Jesus. So, point being, a little listening can change your life. And I guess as we're wondering on what it means to be leaders, wondering about the church today, this invitation for us to take seriously this kind of deeper listening, it has as its the possibility of actually being a little risky, right? It has the possibility of changing us as much as it changed Peter. I mean, so think about what's going on with this vision for a minute. Peter is in this spiritual state where he's having this emotional encounter with God up on the roof, and he's in this kind of tension with God where he's being asked by God to do something that would be so outside of what he understood it meant to be a Jewish man. Peter could not comprehend it. It's kind of hard for us to wrap around how repulsive it probably was for Peter to even imagine the idea of eating the kinds of things that were on that sheet. Mm-hmm. I mean, think for a minute in your own head, what are the kinds of things that you would say my church would never do, but that maybe actually we're called to do? You know, it's that kind of thing. I get to work with churches all over the country who, if I say, is the demographic of your congregation similar to the demographic of your neighborhood, they ask me, what do I mean by neighborhood?
Because they want to
Now,
include 20 miles away in the nice
yes,
houses or something,
because,
whatever, people are
right,
commuting.
right. Because the fact of the matter is, we know that that's an avoidance, right? Question.
Yeah,
What is? Yeah, well, they know what I mean when
yeah,
I say right. And that instinct that we all have to want to keep doing what we've been doing, to do what we're familiar with, to do what's comfortable. It was Peter's instinct too. We have it right here in this text. Peter's, like, I'm a Jewish man. I'm not going to eat that stuff, even if God's telling me to do it. But we see him struggling with this vision that he has, to the extent where when Cornelius's guys show up, he does something he would never have done. He welcomes these people into his house, and in doing that, has a meal with them, also kind of an uncool thing to do if you're a Jewish person.
right.
I mean, remember, they're sitting in a different place in the Colosseum. There was very little, other than the fact that the Jewish people were often the business owners in the communities. So they were merchants. They would sell their stuff to anybody, but they didn't associate. And here Peter is inviting these people. Now, the Romans were not highly welcomed either, by the way. So inviting these people into community and conversation with him, and then going with them. So I calculated the walk that Peter took, and it had to be about a 38-hour walk.
Whoa, that's
right.
A lot.
Right. Well, I'm preparing to do the Avon walk, and I just want you to know it's 39. It'll be 39 miles. Sorry,
yeah.
I meant to say 39 miles, not 38 hours. 38
Oh,
miles.
okay. Well, either way. Okay. So you're going to do Peter's walk.
Either way, yeah, and it's going to take me 2 days, and that is with the amenities of people helping me have something to drink and whatever else that I'm certain Peter and the guys didn't have on the road, right?
Right.
And Peter does this. He goes. He takes 2 days out of his life to go and do this, and he ends up converting this entire community to being followers of Jesus simply because he was willing to listen. I mean, that's what it boils down to. So I just raise that up for us as we're thinking about how hard this is. We think about Peter's transformation. As we're in this time in this history of our church, I can't help but think how transformed we might be as people of faith if we begin to pay attention and listen.
Well, and Nick wrote this a little while ago before you read the verses from Acts, but it is still relevant. He wrote, by breaking down walls and stereotypes, we expand the middle ring, which opens the door for greater community development and evangelism. Nick's tying it all together. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, well said. Really well said. So I guess what I'm wondering for you to think about is, how is your view of God connected to your capacity to listen? So our own transformation, I believe, and I think this is something each of us have to do individually, is to wonder about, like the woman who was willing to sing in a choir of a group of people who are unlike her own. That's a beautiful thing.
Deb.
So, Deb, you have a different view of God. If you're willing to do something like that, you're stretching beyond your comfort zone. And that's actually the invitation, I think, for all of us during this time of change in our church as leaders. So maybe we can't change everything in our church, We've got a congregation that's stuck in certain ways. But what we can do is we can work on ourselves. And we can begin by who we ourselves personally spend time listening to, and putting ourselves in places where we're going to encounter people who think differently than ourselves. So many times the way congregations have been built has been around an ethnic perspective. That is to say, around a German or a Norwegian or a Scandinavian worldview, so that we could hang out with other people who shared our worldview. Today the call is to break through that, and is to think about how our congregations can be places that equip people, frankly, to engage the diversity of views in the world around us, and to see God in that. Not to see different as bad, but to see different as a different angle of view on God. Does
Well,
that make sense?
yes, you're going straight for the shift from fear to hope with that statement.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
David wrote, imagine things that we, our church, have never done before and be willing to do it. That's a great challenge, David. Thank you.
Yeah, it really is. So as you think about listening, I'm kind of curious, who might you listen to? Who in your own life might you be willing to listen to? Who is it in your congregation that you might listen to? And how is it that some of that listening might connect to your own congregation's ministry, or maybe even just your personal ministry? So sometimes those opportunities to listen, they show up in unexpected ways. They show up when you're waiting in line at the grocery store, or when you are, working with your own children, or driving carpool, or whatever you're doing in daily life.
Right.
The opportunity to listen to people who are outside of your worldview.
Ginny wrote, our church's theme for the year is In the Neighborhood for Good. I like that it rhymes too. We are working on tying all of our activities and ministries to that theme in an effort to enhance our presence and service among the people who live around our building. So, Ginny, you know exactly what neighborhood is, just like everyone else. Thank you.
That's really great. Well, it will be time to close our conversation with a prayer in just a minute. I just wondered, are there any other questions that we should be responding to?
No, you've given some really great resources and ways to follow up, so thank you for that. I'd love to give you the last word, and then there are a few quick housekeeping announcements. So go ahead.
Great. Okay, Chris, if you go back to the slide right before, I just want you to see this quote. It's a beautiful thing. It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. That's the invitation for us, is to think, as we're wondering about the church, is to think about how do we adapt in a changing world. And if you'll just go on to the next two slides. There we go, we'll do that one. So the one thing that you can do that will strengthen your own leadership and your congregation's leadership as well is to deeply, intentionally listen to God. And so as I wrap up my conversation with you, I think what I'd like to do is to invite you to take seriously your own prayer practice, to create disciplines in your own life that open you up to being a person that becomes conscious of your own filters, all the kinds of things that we talked about earlier that become assumptions that get in the way of us actually listening well, so that we can listen to God coming to us in surprising places. And I'd like to close with a word of prayer on the next slide.
Thank you.
Oh God, you've called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supporting us. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for being with us, Peggy.
You're so welcome. It's been a real privilege.
Oh, so fun. And thank you all, everyone who popped in with questions and comments, and thank you to all who are listening after the fact. A couple quick reminders before we sign off. This webinar, along with all the others in the series, is recorded and archived on the Practice Discipleship website. You can see it there, practicediscipleship.org. Please feel free to download it. Use it with other members of your congregation, volunteers, church council, your neighbor, whoever needs to hear this. This is not about walls. This is about sharing it widely. You can even share it with a non-Lutheran.
Nice.
Seriously. You can also download from the Practice Discipleship site videos and curriculum from previous years to use in your congregation and networks. Each synod in the ELCA has a Practice Discipleship coach who's been trained to offer seminars on these webinars locally in your own synod. So if you'd rather do a live version, or you would like to invite someone to a live version, look at the Practice Discipleship website where training events are posted. If you don't see your synod, keep checking back for updates. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So the Facebook page I mentioned earlier, you can search Practice Discipleship Initiative, or on Twitter it's at ELCAPD, and that's where you'll find links to these two resources, which, will fade into the history, but by the time those fade into the history, these videos will be on the Practice Discipleship website, and the links to these resources are right below. Coming this Tuesday is the third Tuesday conversation. This month's conversation is an introduction and tour of the new and improved Martin's List with Shannon Savage Howie, and she is the person who has led that effort. So you'll get to hear all about that. Our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, April 14th at 1 p.m. Central. The title is Wondering Through Service Learning with Mark Jackson, professor at Trinity Lutheran College. So join us next month. We'll see you then. Invite a friend, and we'll see you all in April. Thanks again, Peggy.
You're so welcome. Have a great day.